Okay, welcome everyone. I'll just begin. I meant to say last time, I had this same picture up at the beginning, and I meant to explain it's because I mentioned William Turner, the famous William Turner, a few weeks ago, who didn't live at 16 St. John Street in the Blackfriars accommodation. So this time, this is a picture by William Turner, the slightly less famous William Turner, however, who did live at 16 St. John Street. So I thought I should point that out as an exciting relationship between Blackfriars and the art world. That's also fortuitous because I'm afraid this lecture is going to have quite a lot of philosophy and not that many pictures, for which I apologise, but at least there's one to start off with. So we finished with theories of art last week. Obviously that took 2 weeks and we went through 4 theories of art in total. This week we're looking at the subject of aesthetic properties. So I'm going to begin by introducing the notion of aesthetic properties. Then I'm going to present, I think, 4 ways in which we might make the distinction between aesthetic properties and non-aesthetic properties. After that, I'm going to talk about what the relationship is between aesthetic properties and non-aesthetic properties, focusing mainly on a very famous and influential paper by the British aesthetician Frank Sibley, and also to a lesser degree another very influential paper by the American aesthetician Kendall Walton. Finally, I might say something about expression and representation, which sort of fit under the heading of aesthetic properties, because works of art, aesthetic objects, have expressive properties and representational properties. I promised to talk about that subject a few weeks ago and never got round to it. It's not unlikely I won't get round to it today either, but we will see. So in the second 2 lectures of the term, I talked about the beautiful and the sublime, and occasionally I referred to these things as aesthetic properties. But I didn't really say what I meant by aesthetic properties there, rather I kind of smoothed over it by saying or concepts or whatever. So the term property in this context isn't necessarily the one we want to use. There are other terms which have similar meanings, like attribute or features or characteristics. In some contexts in philosophy, these terms are used with different connotations or with stipulated different meanings, but they're also frequently used interchangeably, so I've really just chosen property in this context. Again, in some contexts, by calling something a property, you make a philosophical or metaphysical commitment to the kind of thing that it is. Frequently, people's ontologies involve objects and properties and substances and so forth, and these are all characterized in specific ways. When I talk about aesthetic properties today, I don't mean to make any such commitment. By property, I just mean whatever it is you predicate of things. Predication being where you say, for instance, this table is beautiful, right? I'm predicating beauty of the table. That is sufficient in this loose and broad sense, the beauty to be a property. So where properties are just whatever we predicate of things, it shouldn't be controversial that beauty and sublimity are properties, because we do predicate them on things, or at least we do beauty sometimes, not sublimity so much these days, but we might do. And indeed, they are the 2 properties which have received the most attention in the history of aesthetics, as we know from having looked at Plato and Aristotle and Kant and so forth. However, that changes in the 20th century. So I suppose around the middle of the 20th century, perhaps a bit earlier, there's a shift in focus in aesthetics, and aestheticians start encouraging one another to look at a far wider range of properties. There's a famous quotation from the ordinary language philosopher, the Oxford philosopher J.L. Austin, which sometimes comes up in this context, in a 1956 paper, I don't know if I've got the title, it's an Aristotelian Society paper, Austin argues, well, he argues generally that philosophy is better done in areas where ordinary language is both rich and also, insofar as possible, untouched by philosophical theorizing, presumably because philosophical theorizing will lead us astray. So applying this idea briefly to aesthetics, Austin says, if only we could forget about the beautiful for a while and get down to the dainty and the dumpy. So this is Austin's second cameo, so I thought I'd bring him back by popular demand. Also because I only have about 4 more pictures. So Austin doesn't explain himself there. He moves on to other topics. But it seems he's obviously assuming that daintiness and dumpiness are, for some reason, properties in which aestheticians should be taking an interest. Properties which are perhaps, in some sense, themselves aesthetic. Now, I think this is intuitively compelling. It seems as though some properties, including daintiness and dumpiness, interest us in something like the same way that beauty interests us, or the sublime, or indeed the ugly. And we might be able to distinguish, therefore, a group of properties which engage our interest in this way from another group of properties which don't, which might include things like being 4 foot tall or being room temperature. I take it that if Austin had said, if only we could forget about the beautiful and get down to the 4 foot tall and the room temperature, we wouldn't understand what he means. The fact that we do suggests that he's getting at something. So just based on that intuition that there's a distinction to be made between these two kinds of properties, we might attempt to extend the distinction. So we might guess that non-aesthetic properties will probably include being 4 foot tall, being room temperature, being large, being circular, green, slow, monosyllabic, and so on. And then aesthetic properties would include being beautiful, sublime, ugly, dainty, dumpy, graceful, garish, and other such things. And we might also include on the list of aesthetic properties representational properties, such as being a picture depicting J.L. Austin, or indeed expressive properties, like being a piece of music expressing sadness, or a sad piece of music, as we would usually say, more simply. I'm jumping the gun a bit. Some aestheticians would disagree with this. I think there are probably some who would include all of these things, including expressive and representational properties. There are certainly some who include either of those as aesthetic, but then there are others again who want to make the aesthetic a narrower area, excluding one or both of the expressive or representational properties. I get the impression that the norm is to include expressive properties, but exclude representational properties, which might be telling. Perhaps being a sad piece of music is a bit more like being beautiful or ugly than representing J.L. Austin is. Perhaps not. So there seems to be an intuitive distinction here. But as philosophers, we might want to try and make it somewhat more specific and try to develop a theory in which to explain the distinction between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties. So one author who's extremely important in the history of 20th century aesthetics, at least in the English language speaking world, who engages with this question is the British aesthetician Frank Sibley. He has several articles, all of which are very, well, I suppose there's one which is fantastically influential, entitled The Concept of the Aesthetic, which came out in 1959. And then there's another one I'll mention a little bit later on, entitled Aesthetic and Non-Aesthetic in 1965. And there's further work as well. These have been collected together into a book. So these are generally short pieces, but densely filled with philosophical insights. And so in the 1959 article, The Concept of the Aesthetic, Sibley introduces the distinction between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic. He does so to begin with by giving examples of that, as I've done. So he says on one hand there are terms like uses pale colours, or has a fast tempo, or contains many characters. And Sibley suggests of these terms, ones which intuitively we might think are non-aesthetic, that they denote properties that don't require any special faculty of taste in order to apply them. He says, such remarks may be made by, and such features pointed out to, anyone with normal eyes, ears, and intelligence. On the other hand, Sibley lists some properties, things like is deeply moving, lacks balance, or sets up an exciting tension. And he suggests that the application of these terms does seem to require some faculty over and above normal sense experience. So he says, the making of such remarks as these requires the exercise of taste, perceptiveness, or sensitivity of the aesthetic discrimination or appreciation. Obviously, if that was a definition, it'd be circular because he's put aesthetic in there. But I think it's just meant to be getting at the intuitive idea that someone can have perfectly good hearing, perfectly good eyesight, and therefore be able to see, for instance, that J.L. Austin's glasses are a certain shape and his hair a certain style, but without being able to judge the aesthetic features of J.L. Austin's face, which is, has a kind of slightly humorous dignity to it, or something along those lines, I suppose. Humour-filled dignity, perhaps. I meant the humour on his side from the slight smile. I'll give a different example. There you go. That's Paolo Veronese's 1562/1563 painting of the wedding at Cana, the great Venetian, late Renaissance painter. Anyone with normal eyesight can tell that the sky is pale blue, and that the painting depicts many characters. You see, I looked for one that has the properties Sibley mentions. But possibly you need more than everyday sense perception to tell whether or not the painting exhibits balance. Presumably it does. It seems to be an exquisitely balanced and beautiful work in a quite a classical sense of beauty. But perhaps if you were just analysing it in a mechanical way, you'd say, no, it can't be balanced. There's a tower on that side, but not on that side. This side's much darker, and so forth. That at least is supposed to be the idea. So Sibley classifies these two kinds of property as aesthetic and non-aesthetic. Non-aesthetic properties don't require a special faculty of taste to apply them. Aesthetic properties do. I think that's quite an intuitive way of making the distinction. We might be worried that it depends on this unexplicated notion of taste. Sibley doesn't tell us precisely what he means by that. He leaves the notion unanalyzed. Taste is an important concept in the history of aesthetics. I hopefully mentioned it before, at least in passing. So it's not as if people won't have any idea what he means by this, but nonetheless, we might think there could be more philosophical rigor added to this account. I'll just describe a couple of more recent accounts, both of which were developed by the contemporary English aesthetician Nick Zangwill, who's actually come up a few times now in these lectures. Zangwill has a very compelling 1998 article entitled, it's entitled The Concept of the Aesthetic. Sorry, I might have called Sibley's one that. Sibley's is Aesthetic Concepts. Zangwill's is The Concept of the Aesthetic. In that article, Zangwill develops two ways in which we might make this distinction between aesthetic and non-aesthetic properties, both of which differ slightly from the merely intuitive distinction Austin uses, or the distinction in terms of the faculty of taste, which Sibley develops. So Zangwill first suggests that we might give a kind of neo-Kantian account of the distinction between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic. So you might remember from lecture 3, where I spoke an awful lot about Kant, that Kant characterizes beauty, and indeed the sublime, in terms of subjective universality. subjective here, meaning that when we judge something to be beautiful or judge it to be sublime, we do so on the basis of a felt, try to get the term right here, a felt response, one of pleasure in Kant, although there could perhaps be other kinds of felt responses. A felt response in particular as opposed to by the application of a concept to a thing. Universality here means what you would expect it to, that these judgments are supposed to apply the same for everyone. When we judge something to be beautiful, we expect other people to agree with us that it's beautiful, or perhaps to convince us otherwise that we're mistaken. And in particular, this is what distinguishes aesthetic judgments from merely liking things. When you like something, like gin and tonics, which Samuel Hughes likes, you like it because of a felt response, because of pleasure, but there's no universality there. You don't expect other people to like everything you like. So Kant calls these things merely agreeable. So Zangwill's suggestion is that we might be able to extend Kant's account of beauty and of the sublime in such a way that it will also cover those properties we intuitively class as aesthetic, the large lists of additional properties which start getting talked about in the 20th century. And if we could do so, then we'd have a theoretical basis for making this distinction. This project meets with an immediate problem, which is that Zangwill at least suggests that although the dainty and the dumpy might be universal, we expect people to agree with us that a spherical shape is more dumpy and a thin and curved one perhaps is more dainty. So there's universality, but it's not clear that these judgments are made on the basis of a felt response. Rather, at least according to Zangwill, and it seems quite compelling, we're doing something like applying a concept. He suggests what we're doing is applying a concept imaginatively. This is based on the idea, roughly speaking, that we can view things either as dumpy or not as dumpy, and we'd be led to view things in that way. Sometimes this is compared to the phenomenon of aspect appreciation. You probably know, I could have had a picture here, but the famous duck-rabbit picture comes up in these contexts. You can see it both as a duck and as a rabbit, and you can indeed switch between the two by an act of will, or at least some people can. So it seems like, at least in its original form, Kant's idea of beauty as a property exhibiting subjective universality can't be extended to these other aesthetic properties. However, Zangwill suggests, well, maybe we could extend our definition a little and say that aesthetic properties are those which are either universal and made or judged from a felt response, or those which are universal and judged by an imaginative application of a concept. Zangwill gives up on that project at this stage on the grounds that this seems to be becoming somewhat theoretically messy. This is an ad hoc extension, and in particular because he thinks that at this stage there's going to be no way to avoid including representational properties as aesthetic, and he feels that that's a bad idea. He doesn't actually explain why, apart from saying that most aestheticians don't include representational properties as aesthetic properties. But probably there are intuitive grounds on which most aestheticians don't do that. So there might be good reasons to avoid it. However, although Zangwill gives up this project, it gets pretty close, it seems, if it'll work. If we could say that properties count as subjective either if they're based on a felt response or the imaginative application of a concept, then aesthetic properties are subjectively universal properties. It would cut pretty closely with our intuitive distinctions, especially because some aestheticians do include representational properties. So perhaps Zangwill gives that up too early. In any case, he moves on to his own account, which is the fourth way of making this distinction I'll describe before moving on. So Zangwill classes judgments of beauty and ugliness in the broad sense as verdictive because they cast overall verdicts about an object's aesthetic value. And I think I've mentioned this position of his earlier on. He compares these to judgments of the dainty and the dumpy and so forth, which he describes as being substantive. The substantive properties, Zangwill suggests, stand in a hierarchical relation to the verdictive ones. So this means two things for Zangwill. First, the substantive properties determine the verdictive properties, overall aesthetic value and disvalue. When something is overall beautiful or overall ugly, we can say this is because it is dainty and graceful and so forth, or because it's dumpy and morose and whatever else. And secondly, these substantive properties, Zangwill says, these are really ways of being beautiful or ways of being ugly. So unlike in the case of secondary qualities and relational properties, there's no such thing as a normatively neutral application of a substantive aesthetic property. We're always implying something normatively about the overall aesthetic value of something, even if you can't just add up the substantive properties to get the verdictive one in a crude way. That's all I'll say about different ways of making the distinction between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic. There are probably lots of other ways in which you might try to do it. Perhaps the best way is just the intuitive way, since we seem to be able to make an intuitive distinction. I'm rather inclined to Zangwill's final view, but I won't talk about why that is, since it would be good to move on to the question of the relationship between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic. So supposing there is a distinction to be made here, and it seems pretty likely that there is, we might ask, well, how are the two related, aesthetic properties and non-aesthetic properties? Are they completely different groups? Do one depend on the other, and so forth? And I think in the history of aesthetics, we see two trends pulling in opposite directions concerning this question. So there's one trend that tries to reduce the aesthetic to the non-aesthetic, so that it's in no way anything over and above the non-aesthetic. And then the other trend attempts to grant the aesthetic some kind of independence or autonomy. So when we perceive an object as beautiful or graceful or unbalanced or whatever, I think it's pretty uncontroversial that we tend to do so by seeing its normal non-aesthetic properties, the ones we encounter in everyday life when we're not paying attention to the aesthetic features. And we don't seem to exercise any additional perceptive or perceptual faculty in doing so. Neither do we seem to possess any additional organ in over and above eyes and ears and so forth in order to perform this. And so considerations of this kind seem to suggest that if aesthetic terms do pick out a special group of properties, these properties would have to be in some sense nothing over and above the normal properties, the normal perceptual properties which we encounter. And this might tempt us to endorse something like a reductive view, which reduces the aesthetic to the non-aesthetic. And I think I'm right in saying that this is a view that's been lurking in the background a lot of the time in the history of philosophical aesthetics. We might, for example, remind ourselves of the philosophers who endorsed what I called the compositional account of beauty back in lecture 2, who try to reduce beauty to something like harmonious composition or perhaps the mathematical properties of a thing. Aristotle in the Poetics, for instance, says to be beautiful, a living creature, and every whole made up of parts must present a certain order in its arrangement of parts. In the metaphysics, the chief forms of beauty are order, symmetry, and definiteness. If we think that order, symmetry, and definiteness are non-aesthetic properties, and they sound like non-aesthetic properties, probably, then that looks like a reductive view of aesthetic properties, of beauty at least. And we saw this also in the work of the Roman architect Vitruvius, and perhaps in Thomas and his followers, early modern thinkers like Jean Terrasson and Leibniz. So there seems to be a pretty strong historical tendency at various points in the history of philosophy in favour of reducing aesthetic properties to non-aesthetic properties, and ideally to those which are well understood by another discipline, such as mathematics or the physical sciences, presumably so that aesthetics and art could benefit from shredding its unscientific and esoteric pretensions. At least that's the impression one gets from the Enlightenment thinkers like Terrasson. So in addition to lots of instances of this reductivist tendency in the history of aesthetics, we also find lots of philosophers who seem to find the idea of a simple reduction of aesthetic properties to non-aesthetics extremely implausible. I have an example from Hegel's Lectures on Aesthetics, published posthumously in 1835. He says towards the beginning of those that it seems that the production and perception of art escapes from every fetter of rule and regularity. The idea being that you can't just give it, a harmonious composition, symmetry, and so forth, and then you'll have an aesthetically pleasing object. Rather, you need an artist to come along and do something less mechanical than that. I have a picture of Hegel, since I don't mention him much else. I'm sorry, it's so close. Wouldn't fill the screen otherwise. And if it really were possible, of course, to lay down rules by which we could achieve gracefulness and balance and so forth, we might wonder why no one's done so. Well, at least if people haven't done so, perhaps you'd argue that they had. It's at least not obvious. And on the contrary, we do have a sense that in order to achieve these things, you need something like the kind of taste that Sibley talks about, a special kind of judgment. So quite a good quotation that also exhibits this kind of idea can be found in Burke's work, which I already talked about at some length earlier in the series on the beautiful and the sublime. Burke says, "You may assign any proportions you please to every part of the human body, and I undertake that a painter shall observe them all, and notwithstanding produce, if he pleases, a very ugly figure." So the idea being there, you could dictate all of the compositional features, and perhaps even all the non-aesthetic features, to a painter and say, produce a figure according to these, and it would still be up to the painter to make it beautiful or ugly. Another element in this trend of thought concerns the idea of proof in discussions of aesthetics. You might think that if the aesthetic depended on the non-aesthetic, at least in any simple reductive way, then it ought to be possible to prove what aesthetic properties an object has. For instance, you could say, well, as we know, rectangular things below 6 foot tall are beautiful, so this table is beautiful. You could have principles from which to adduce aesthetic judgments. And this, again, is an idea which has met with considerable resistance in the history of philosophy. In the Critique of Judgment, Kant says, if someone reads me his poem or takes me to a play that in the end fails to please my taste, then he can adduce Watteau or Lessing or even older and more famous critics of taste and adduce all the rules they established as proofs that his poem is beautiful. I will stop my ears, listen to no reasons and arguments, and would rather believe that those critics were false than allow that my judgment should be determined by means of a priori grounds of proof, since it is supposed to be a judgment of taste, and not of the understanding of reason. Obviously, you have an anticipation, or probably an influence on Sibley there in the idea that it's taste that's involved here. An idea Kant in turn takes, I suppose, from British sentimentalists in the 18th century. So these quotations seem to stand in stark contrast from the compositionalist view, on which you can reduce the aesthetic to non-aesthetic properties like mathematical properties. And so there seems to be a clear opposition of historical trends. Somewhat interestingly, of course, you might have noticed that these two trends don't occur simultaneously, at least in the quotations I've given, and in fact it's only around the Enlightenment that you start getting philosophers insisting that it's not possible to produce aesthetic properties by mechanical means, and you might speculate that this is bound up with the Romantic reaction against the Enlightenment, the idea that in some way the arts and the aesthetic and many other things are above or beyond the Newtonian mechanistic world or worldview that came to dominate then. So I'll return now to Sibley's extremely influential essay on this topic, although entitled Aesthetic Concepts, not the concept of the aesthetic. This is the 1959 paper. Although Sibley doesn't discuss this historical tension, he can be read as, in some sense, offering an attempt at reconciliation between these two views about the relationship between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic. So earlier I noted that when we perceive or judge aesthetic properties, we seem to do so by our ordinary perceptual faculties, by sight and hearing, and by our normal perceptual organs. To this, Sibley adds that, moreover, when we explain our application of an aesthetic term, we often do so by appealing to non-aesthetic features of the object under consideration. So we might say, for instance, that a painting lacks balance because there's too many figures all the way over to one corner. I suppose too many figures might still be an aesthetic judgment. We might say a painting lacks balance because there are lots and lots of figures grouped in one corner and not in any others. In that kind of case, we seem to explain, perhaps in some sense to justify, an aesthetic judgment in terms of non-aesthetic properties. So that's a further consideration, I suppose, in favour of the reductive view, or the view that the aesthetic is nothing over and above the non-aesthetic. And Sibley adds to this that when no such explanation has been given for the application of an aesthetic concept, or for a judgment that an aesthetic concept applies, it's reasonable to ask for one, usually. And on these grounds, Sibley endorses the view that the aesthetic properties do depend quite heavily on the non-aesthetic. So he says, aesthetic words apply ultimately because of, and aesthetic qualities ultimately depend upon, the presence of features which are visible, audible, or otherwise discernible without any exercise of taste or sensibility. The aesthetic properties depend on those properties which are non-aesthetic. They apply because of those properties. So this seems like an endorsement of something very close to the reductionist thesis I mentioned above, that the aesthetic can simply be reduced to the non-aesthetic. However, Sibley also acknowledges the point manifest in the quotations from Kant and others, the apparent lack of rules by which to produce and identify aesthetic properties, or indeed to prove that they're present. So as such, in addition to the dependence thesis, Sibley adds another thesis which we might consider as one of autonomy. He says, there are no sufficient conditions, no non-aesthetic features, such that the presence of some set or number of them will beyond question justify or warrant the application of an aesthetic term. So Sibley certainly isn't claiming that aesthetic properties don't depend on non-aesthetic properties, quite the contrary, they do. And he even acknowledges there might be some law-like relationships between the two. For instance, he suggests probably if something is garish, which is an aesthetic property, then it must contain some bright colours, which is a non-aesthetic property. However, Sibley is adamant that non-aesthetic properties are never sufficient for aesthetic properties. So never is it the case that you can describe an object purely in terms of its non-aesthetic properties and have that be sufficient to warrant a judgment that it must also have certain aesthetic properties. Now, this position of Sibley's, he illustrates it with various examples, which I won't go into, but it represents or follows the pattern of a classic philosophical move, an early instance of which you can find in the 1922 work, The Concept of Intrinsic Value by G. Moore. He presents a very similar picture of the relationship there between the moral and the non-moral. More recently, there's a classic 1970 article entitled Mental Events by Donald Davidson, which presents very much the same kind of picture of relationship between the mental and the non-mental, or the physical, I think he says. And in each of these cases, a domain is identified which in some sense stands out from the rest of the everyday natural world, be it the aesthetic or the moral or the mental. And the respective theory proposes that that domain, the mental, the moral, the aesthetic, depends upon that which is outside of it, the non-aesthetic, the non-moral, the non-mental, but nonetheless is somehow autonomous from it, or in Davidson's terms, anomalous, which he uses to mean not related to it in a law-like way. Although anomalous doesn't come from and nomos, not law-like, it comes from and homolos, not the same. Or at least I believe it does, in which case that's an unfortunate coinage. So this is a move you can see exhibited widely in philosophy, this idea that these two areas are connected. Somehow we want to say that one depends on another, but nonetheless we don't think it can be reduced to that. We feel that in some way it's not merely a matter of this lower or grounding area, so we say, well, it depends on it in an autonomous way or an anomalous way. And this might be seen to reconcile these two intuitions. And if it does, that would be one advantage of Sibley's position on this stuff. Second advantage, Sibley notes himself, when he's discussing his theory in a later paper, which is that he thinks his account of aesthetic properties can explain how criticism is possible. Criticism meaning here not saying something's rubbish, but writing essays and so forth about poetry and plays, explaining what aesthetic properties they have, why people have made mistakes about the aesthetic properties they have, giving overall verdictive judgments and so forth. So frequently the worry has been expressed, that if there are no firm rules relating the aesthetic to the non-aesthetic, then the practice of criticism has no basis. We might be reminded here of Kant's comments about Bateau and Lessing not wanting to listen to critics. However, Sibley thinks that on his account he can, to some degree, account for the possibility of criticism. He does so by distinguishing between two ways of giving a reason for a critical judgment. So the worry was, without rules linking aesthetic to non-aesthetic, without rule governance generally in this area, critics couldn't give reasons or couldn't have reasons for their judgments. Sibley says, well, we should distinguish between explanatory reasons and what we might call justifying reasons. And he says, well, it might be that aestheticians or critics can't give justifying reasons for their judgments. They can't say, well, look, it's got this, and this as non-aesthetic properties, so it must be beautiful, or it must be graceful. But they can nonetheless give explanatory reasons. They can say, well, look, the reason it's graceful is because of these beautiful curved lines here. They shouldn't say beautiful there, that would be circular. It's graceful because of these curved flowing lines, that kind of thing. So they can give some kind of reason, even if not justifying ones. Despite these advantages, I think Sibley's position, at least understood in the way I presented it, something I'll come to in a moment, might run into difficulties. Okay, so on the one hand, we want, or Sibley wants it to be the case, that the aesthetic properties of an object depend upon its non-aesthetic properties, and indeed for it to be true that we can say it has this aesthetic property because of this non-aesthetic property. It's explained by it. But on the other hand, he wants to say that the non-aesthetic properties are never sufficient for the aesthetic properties. And I'm taking that to mean something like this. A property or set of properties F is sufficient for another property G if any object that has F must have G. So it's not clear that this is actually possible. We could consider the following thought experiments. Suppose we had an exact double of our world in all of its, well, a double in all of its non-aesthetic features. A world exactly like ours in its non-aesthetic features. We can ask, would that world have the same aesthetic properties as our world? Would the aesthetic properties also be the same? For example, would the duplicate world statue of Michelangelo's David have the same aesthetic properties as the real David? Here it is. That's the real one, not the duplicate one. But presumably the duplicate one would look very similar. So intuitively we might think, yeah, it must have the same aesthetic properties if the non-aesthetic properties are the same, if there is the same mathematical proportions and everything here. Although the quotation from Burke earlier might suggest to the contrary. But suppose we followed that line and said, yes, it must have the same aesthetic properties. After all, Sibley has said the aesthetic properties depend on the non-aesthetic ones. He said that they're because of the aesthetic ones, the non-aesthetic ones. So it seems natural to suppose that since the same non-aesthetic ones are there, the same aesthetic ones will be there. We run into the immediate problem that it looks like the non-aesthetic properties are sufficient for the aesthetic properties after all. Contrary to what Sibley seemed to be saying about them. And indeed, we can describe, well, this isn't the double, we can describe the double Michelangelo's David in completely non-aesthetic terms. We say it's an exact copy of the real David in all of its non-aesthetic features. And it seems that that non-aesthetic description warrants us to make all the aesthetic judgments about it that we make about the real David. Well, if it's the case that it's going to have the same aesthetic properties. Which, again, seems to conflict with Sibley's claim that we can never be warranted in making an aesthetic judgment on the basis of non-aesthetic properties. So suppose we took the opposite view and said, no, okay, the duplicate world objects won't have the same aesthetic properties, or at least they needn't do so, because the non-aesthetic is not sufficient for the aesthetic. Well, in that case, we run into a different problem, which is that it's not clear that we can make sense of Sibley's claim that we can explain our aesthetic judgments in terms of non-aesthetic properties on this view. The problem here is, I mean, suppose we say of Michelangelo's David, this is a very stirring piece of sculpture because of, I don't know, because of the proportions of the limbs, right? Well, that seems fine. If we then go on to say, but the duplicate Michelangelo's David has the same proportions of limbs, but isn't stirring, someone might say, well, hang on, you haven't explained why it's stirring then. One way this is sometimes put, this kind of problem in philosophy, is in terms of contrastivity. It's often said that if your explanation is going to explain why something is F rather than not F, it had better pick out something which wouldn't have been the case if it were not F. This is important in the philosophy of quantum mechanics and this kind of thing, and also of free will. can you, if you're a libertarian about free will, if you think free actions are undetermined, they're not determined by the past, can you explain why someone did the thing they did freely? Why did he wave his arm freely rather than not? Well, anything you refer to by way of an explanation because he wanted to, because he needed to explain a philosophical point, whatever, is also going to have been true in the counterfactual situation in which he didn't wave his arm. So it seems contrastive explanations are lacking here. Now, supposing we think that explanations have to be contrastive in that way, it seems the position I've attributed to Sibley here faces an ineluctable dilemma. On the one hand, aesthetic properties are autonomous in that the non-aesthetic aren't sufficient for them, but then we can't explain them in terms of the non-aesthetic. On the other hand, perhaps we can explain them in terms of non-aesthetic properties, but in that case, the non-aesthetic properties are sufficient for them, and we're back to the what looks like the reductive view. And it's worth noting that this criticism of this position is, in its essence, the same as one which was made very famously made by the American metaphysician Taegon Kim of Donald Davidson's theory of mind, the theory I mentioned earlier, the 1970 paper, Mental Events. Davidson offers a very similar view of relationship between the mental and the non-mental, and Kim points out, although much more precisely than I have done, that it doesn't look like this is going to work, because if it's true that the mental depends on the non-mental in the appropriate way, for Davidson it's not one of explanation in particular, it's actually one of supervenience, but that doesn't matter. If it depends on it in this way, you're going to end up with something like a reductive view after all, at least reductive in the classical sense introduced by Ernst Nagel in a 1961 paper, but that's sort of tangential. It seems to me the easiest way to respond to this problem would be to give up the idea that the non-aesthetic properties aren't sufficient for the aesthetic, and to say something like, well, okay, non-aesthetic properties are sufficient for aesthetic properties, but it's just really very complex. And so, yes, if you have exactly the same non-aesthetic properties, if you have an entire world with exactly the same non-aesthetic properties, then it will have the same aesthetic properties. However, this is never going to be of any use in our everyday judgment or reasoning about objects, because not only is it the case that every work of art or object of aesthetic appreciation we come across is going to differ a little bit in its own intrinsic properties, there are also all sorts of extrinsic properties which are going to be changing, which could be relevant to what aesthetic properties it ends up having. However, if we say that it's not clear we have as interesting a view or as satisfactory a reconciliation of the intuitions, the historical trends I mentioned earlier, because it seems we do end up with some kind of reductionism about the aesthetic, and well, I think we might be left over with a feeling that this hasn't captured something about how the aesthetic is nonetheless over and above the non-aesthetic. So that would be a problem with making that simple move. I'll just conclude by adding a small coda on this discussion of Sibley. I became worried whilst writing this lecture that possibly I'm attributing to Sibley a view that isn't quite his, and so giving you an uncharitable reading of his paper. This is because some authors seem to present Sibley as not actually ever denying that the non-aesthetic properties are sufficient for the aesthetic in the manner I've described, what we might call metaphysical sufficiency. If an object has F, then it must have G. They suggest that Sibley only ever meant they're never logically sufficient. That is, the sentence, the object has F, won't entail the sentence, the object has G, something like that. And one reason we might take to suppose this was Sibley's view is that he has this later 1965 paper entitled Aesthetic and Non-Aesthetic, where he really does seem to make only that much weaker claim that the non-aesthetic is never logically sufficient for the aesthetic. And moreover, I was speaking the other day from Nick Zangwill about Sibley, Sibley's aesthetics, and Nick Zangwill said to me that these two articles were actually originally the same article and were divided up, which might make you doubtful that he could have changed his view halfway through, despite them being published 6 years apart. So I should acknowledge that this might be an uncharitable interpretation. On the other hand, I think it's worth pointing out that Sibley does appear to change his view between these two articles to some degree, because in the first one, he insists that the fact that we can never infer aesthetic properties from non-aesthetic properties is not because the relationship between the two is just one of complexity. He says, it must not be thought that the impossibility of stating any conditions other than negative for the application of aesthetic terms is simply a question of extreme complexity, right? In the second paper, in the 1965 one, Sibley considers whether we might not in principle make inferences from non-aesthetic to aesthetic features based on inductive principles, on looking at lots of things and seeing which work. And there he says, oh, well, given the complexity of aesthetic objects, this seems most doubtful, but if we could, then it's at least conceivable that in the future people might be justified in attributing aesthetic properties solely by inference from non-aesthetic features. So, I mean, those two seem like pretty obviously directly contradictory claims about the nature of this phenomenon, suggesting that in the original paper he was committed to the stronger claim, which is in some sense intuitively more satisfactory, but metaphysically more troublesome. And that'll do for today.